basically, I'm going to talk briefly about Piltdown, and then Downhouse, because you're visiting those two places, and then a subject which is, I hope will take more than half the time, Creation Controversies. So that really, and Joshua's long day, I promise you I will get round to it, but it's only going to occupy about 3 or 4 minutes, so that's not going to be my subject. I'm covering much, much more than that. And so it is in 3 sections, and the third section, Creationist Controversies, will be in 3 separate parts also, but I'll explain that when I come to it. So let's look at Piltdown. Now, first of all, when this was exposed in 1953, Dr. Turner, Mr. Tilney, and his son came to the site, and you will see it. I think the stone is still standing. I went there many years ago, been a couple of times. Not a great deal to see, but there's the stone there which they commemorated the find of Piltdown. Then it fell down, and then they put it up again. And there's a picture of the 3 members of the, you might almost call it, not exactly founders, but the prime movers of the evolution protest movement, which eventually became the creation science movement as it is today. But I want to take just one tiny little area of Piltdown, which I think will give you the idea of what went on behind the scenes. It's one very small area, but when you concentrate on that, you will see what has been going on. And first of all, let's look at the first chart. And now note this, you will have to watch the dates on my charts very carefully, because they're very important, the sequence of events. In 1908, Dawson was handed parts of a genuine fossil human skull by grave diggers. All right, 1908. 1909, Dawson met Teilhard de Chardin. 1911, Dawson found further genuine skull pieces. 1912, Dawson, Teilhard, and Woodward started digging in earnest to try and find some more. More genuine skull pieces were found, and all the rest were fake fossils were found. Jaws, animal fossils, and artifacts, like the so-called cricket bat, were found. That's in around about 1912, and a year or so afterwards. The fake canine tooth was found by Teilhard de Chardin in a pile of spoil that had already been looked over. And they said, there's no point in going there. And he suddenly produced the canine tooth. And in 1916, Dawson died. Now, from then onwards, many, many papers were written about Piltdown, but virtually none by Teilhard de Chardin. He hardly ever referred to Piltdown at all. So there was this long period when Piltdown was written about as though it was a genuine find, so till we come to 1953. And in 1953, this is the year, the crucial year, in which the report was published in November. I will quote from a letter that Halstead wrote to the Times. It appeared in the 25th of November, 1978, in the letters column. And it said, there is evidence that the medieval orang-utang lower jaw, which made up the Piltdown jaw, came from the Natural History Museum itself and was provided by Dr. M.A.C. Hinton, a former keeper of zoology. Indeed, according to Hinton himself, the Piltdown man hoax was originally planned and executed within the museum. The current scenario appears to be one of an extensive conspiracy involving Hinton, a few other colleagues in the museum, with Teilhard de Chardin contributing a Tunisian elephant tooth and the, quote, missing canine. So here's Halstead, an evolutionist, pointing very, very specifically at the British Natural History Museum. Now, Mabel Kenwood was the daughter of the owner of that site, the Kenwoods. She was a young girl at the time. She was a young woman at the time at Piltdown, and she testified that the skull pieces were found in undisturbed gravel by her father's diggers. And they were handed to Dawson in 1908. Now, the fact that the skull pieces are genuine is absolutely vital to all this. Now, she was incensed when the whole thing came out. She was incensed that Dawson was being blamed, because Dawson was her personal friend. She knew him very well. And she commissioned Francis Vere, who was a barrister but non-practicing, to write 2 books, Lessons of Piltdown, and one that got a much wider publication. And he wrote in defence of Dawson and the fact that Piltdown was a fraud, but not Dawson was not the culprit. Now, the skull pieces are important, because if fake, then Dawson was the culprit. If the fake pieces were found by Dawson and he faked them, he obviously must have been involved, probably in it. And Teilhard de Chardin could therefore be exonerated. But if the skull pieces were genuine, then when Dawson met Teilhard de Chardin, seeing the possibilities and the potentialities of this so-called find, starts to salt the mine, as they called it, with all these other fakes that made it look as though it was a genuine fossil. In fact, he put the jaw in there from an orangutan, which he got from the British Museum, etc., etc. So it's very important that the skull pieces were either genuine or they were fake. If they were genuine, then Teilhard de Chardin could be implicated. If they were fake, Teilhard de Chardin could not be implicated. Now, if we look at chart number 5, we come to the events of 1953. In the spring of that year, Weiner and Harrison are said to have visited Piltdown. Now, I don't want you to look at that particularly because I'm going to come back to that. I want you to look at the dates that follow it. 27th of July, there was a conference of experts, top-grade experts, I think it was on geology, and one of the things that they went and had a look at while they were all in London was the Piltdown fossils. Now, notice the date, 27th of July, 1953. On the 30th of July, Weiner, Oakley and Washburn were in a hotel nearby, and they were discussing the Piltdown finds. And as they were discussing it, it suddenly occurred, this is the official account of what happened. According to these dates, Weiner, Oakley and Washburn, it suddenly occurred to Weiner that Piltdown might possibly be a fraud. Right? That is the first time that anybody, according to the official account, thought that there was a fraud. He went away, had a very troubled night that night, did some experiments with staining of bones, and eventually, on the 6th of August, he went to his boss, LeGros Clark, and they picked up the phone to Oakley, and they said, look, we have a strong suspicion that this whole lot is fraudulent. So Oakley goes into his laboratory, rings them back an hour or so later, and said, I think you could be right, because I can find some abrasion on some of the teeth. Now, they'd had them all these years, looked at them minutely, and never, ever saw that there was artificial abrasion on the teeth. I'm absolutely convinced that virtually from day one, the top people at the British Natural History Museum knew that they were fraudulent. That is why Louis Leakey was not allowed to inspect them too closely, only the accurate copies of them. So we now get to this troubled night of Weiner, and on the 6th of August they phone Oakley, who is taken aback. My goodness, it never occurred to me, says he, in effect. And yet, only, I think about a year or so before, he'd done some experiments on the teeth, and he half hinted in one of the papers that there's something rather unusual about them. It was almost as indicating that there's something unusual about these fossils. They don't conform to the dating that we want. Now we come to the 15th of August, and they make an official interview of Mabel Kenwood. Now, I interviewed Mabel Kenwood just a year or two before she died when I was doing some research for Piltdown, and she told me quite graphically what happened. Because going back to that very first entry there, chart number 5, you'll see that in the spring of that year, and that could not possibly be as late as July, in the spring of that year, she testifies that in that year, Weiner and Harrison were down at Piltdown, nosing around, trying to find who was still alive, that may have been the original diggers that dug up that so-called coconut, the original skull pieces. Now, they were in there in the spring of that year. All right? So Weiner knew there was something wrong. He knew what was going, that the whole thing was a fraud. And he was scouting on. The whole point of that time was to find out if any of the diggers of Piltdown were still alive. Because if they were still alive, they could come up and they could say, I was there at the time, I found them in virgin gravel, they were not fraudulent, and I handed them to Mr. Dawson. That would blow the whole thing sky high, because if the skull pieces were genuine, as I said, that means that Teilhard de Chardin could then be implicated in all that followed. And Teilhard de Chardin, believe you me, is the darling of the establishment. And so we come to the official interview of Kenwood. Now, there was Harrison and Weiner and 2 or 3 other people coming down to interview Mabel Kenwood, who's the last surviving member that knew anything about those things. And as they sat down, she told me herself, she looked at Weiner and she looked at Kenwood, and she said, you were here in the spring. And Weiner flatly denied it. She said, and so were you. And Harrison flatly denied it. And she was infuriated that they should actually lie to her because they'd already spoken to her in the spring. You see, if they were nosing around Piltdown in the springtime, all this idea of Weiner having this troubled night and ringing up Oakley, it was all carefully planned. They knew exactly what the problem was, and they were determined that they were going to be the ones in control of the exposure, and they didn't want anybody from outside saying, this is a fraud, and starting to go into the whole system. And so we have this whole point is that the official sequence of events of Weiner having this troubled night is a complete and absolute fabrication. And if you read some of the diaries, I think it's a chap called Spencer who went into this, you'd be surprised how much information I can get out of evolutionist books. It is absolutely riddled with information if you know how to look for it. And most of my stuff comes from evolutionists. And you just compare one account with another, you find there's a discrepancy, and you go into it, and boy, does it show up a can of worms eventually. And so the whole point is that the whole thing was actually, as Housted said, planned and executed within the British Natural History Museum. And in 1954, Teilhard de Chardin visited the British Natural History Museum. He was extremely evasive in everything that they asked him. In fact, sometimes they would ask him a question, he would totally ignore it and turn to one side and start talking to somebody else. He just did not want to answer any questions about Piltdown. And the sequel is interesting because Spencer's account says something like, Wynot couldn't get anything out of Teilhard de Chardin, so he shifted his attention to somewhere else. So here's, let's say, a burglar accused of breaking into a house, sitting there not saying anything, and because you can't get anything out of him, you say, oh, well, let him go, I can't get anything from him. And we go and try and see if we can find somebody else who's burgled the house. And that is their attitude to Chardin. Let him off the hook, because, as I said, Teilhard de Chardin is a very useful man. He is the combination, in the eyes of the scientists of the day, of trying to combine some areas of science, or the whole of science, with some quasi-Christian philosophy. He is the link man between the two. And that is why I say he is the darling of the establishment. And he is protected, his name is protected, left, right and centre, all the way down the line. In fact, they accused Dawson of faking some Pevensey bricks. They weren't faked at all, not at all. They had to throw everything black that they could against Charles Dawson. So exactly, I would say there that Piltdown fraud was planned in the British Natural History Museum, and exposure was also carefully planned to shelter the museum and Teilhard from any blame. And as you know, I've written that all ape men are fraudulent, and Piltdown is particularly important because it demonstrates that in many areas the British Natural History Museum is rotten to the core. It must be. If they know that the whole thing is fraudulent, why don't they come out with it? What I was interested in, actually, is because I was actually interested in Down House long before I became interested in creation evolution. I live at Bromley, and Down House is something like 6, 7 or 8 miles away from me, so it's not too far. And when my children were small, we used to go around there. We've been around there a couple of times, long before it became, what it is today. And what I became interested in is because my wife, before she married me, she was quite educated. After that, I can't vouch for anything. But she belonged to a book club, and one of the most fascinating books she had was a book called Period Piece by Gwen Ravarat, who was a granddaughter of Charles Darwin, and she went to Down House while Emma Darwin was still alive. So it's a fascinating book, and I'd just like to really try to not exactly recreate the atmosphere, but try and give you some idea of what life was like at that time, just by giving you some pictures of there. If you can take down the name, you'll probably have to get it from a library because it was published in something like the 1950s. It's well and truly out of date. It's a fascinating story. Whether you're interested in evolution and creation or not, I found it quite fascinating. Period Piece by Gwen Ravarat. She was Darwin, Gwen Darwin. Her father was George Darwin. Right. And she spent many days at Down House while Emma Darwin was still alive. And I visited Down House, as I say, beforehand, and before I became interested in creation. Now, she describes all her aunts and uncles in most beautiful graphic details. They're all quite idiosyncratic, quite strange. And she gave many of the personal details. And one particularly, Aunt Etty, that's Etienne, that's Darwin's daughter, Etienne. As a child, she had a cold. When she was a small child, she had a cold. You'll see that in a minute. She had a cold. And the doctor said to her, yes, the doctor said, well, just give her breakfast in bed. She had breakfast in bed for the rest of her life. That gives you some idea of the strange ways in which the Darwin house ran. Many of them were hypochondriacs, as we know Darwin was, Emma was, and a number of their offspring were also. But then we come to this, which I think is an absolute classic. Here she's ordering dinner with a homemade anti-cold mask on her. And she actually used to meet some people and discuss with them if she thought they may have had a cold or something like that. And that gives you some idea. And I think if I'd have been asked to speak to her in that condition, I would have had an uncontrollable fit of the giggles, I'm afraid. And the aunts and the uncles, generally, for the picture that she portrays, were very kind, warm-hearted, fairly innocent, and many of them hypochondriacs. And some of the pictures that she drew, Gwen Raverick did some drawing. She did become an artist. And there's her mother playing croquet on the lawn with one of the babies tucked under her arm. That's the way she played her croquet. And the mulberry tree, which I think is still alive and still standing, you will see that the windows, the mulberry branches in her day used to tap on the window when the wind was up, and it used to frighten them as small children out of their wits. One of the things, if you go there, I would urge you to go round the sand walk. It's quite a big loop, and the walk back is along a sort of sandy path. And Darwin had it made for contemplation. He used to sort of walk out there and think about things. And there is, part of the way down there, what they call the elephant tree. And it's really not quite as hideous as that, but that is a child's representation. It's really quite a normal tree with a bit of a lump on it, you know. They called it the elephant tree, and it used to frighten them as young children, about 6, 7 or 8, I don't know. And if I had time, I'd read you her account of how her brother came to her one evening or one day and said, "I've been round the sand walk on my own." And she, not to be outdone, took one of their smaller children in a pushchair, put it in the pushchair, and started off, very firmly convinced she's going to walk all the way around the sand walk on her own and not going to run. But then she heard what she thought was rustling, and she started quickening up her pace, and it got faster and faster, and the baby's bouncing around in the pushchair, and she got to the end of the drive and rushed through it and slammed the door behind her, sweating out the top of her brains to realise that she just managed to miss all these ghosties that obviously inhabit the sandwalk. It's rather a dramatic account. And you can imagine that. I'm trying to paint you this picture so that when you go there, you can imagine this sort of effect that this walk has upon small children. Because even when you go down there, it is quite quiet. You're out in the middle of nowhere, although the house is not far away. And it is slightly eerie. I don't know why. It is slightly eerie. And when you walk round, just imagine Gwen Darwin running along with his pushchair and the baby bouncing all over the place, charging for that gate at the end of the line, and with great thankfulness getting past it and slamming the door eventually. So do have a look at that. I'm not going to talk about the upstairs because, as I say, it's all in here. Downhouse has had an expensive refurb, costing a lot of money, and it's recreated, as far as I can understand, you check it when you go, with some of the original furniture, or very close replacements. And there's a figure here of Emma Darwin sitting doing her Peggy work, and you'll see the chair, and when we went there, we used to sit in that chair to think that Emma Darwin actually sat in that same chair, but it's now roped off. And I'll tell you something very unusual about Darwin. I didn't know until I went there. Have a look for this, particularly in the lounge, in the lounge where the grand piano is, and that's all roped off. It will mention a book, and it says there's an example on the table. And what Darwin used to do is, if he had a massive tome to read, and it was rather heavy, and I've never ever heard this before, he would get hold of the book in the middle, rip it in two, put the second half down, read through the first half, which is now half the weight that it was before, and then pick up the second half and read the second half of the book. He ripped books in two. Now, to me, I love books and I read an awful lot, books are almost sort of sacrilege to rip a book in two like that. But that's what he did. Now, I'm not saying that was any reflection upon his character, but but when yes, well, it might be like tearing a telephone directory in half. You know, go rip like that. Say, right now, hand me the next page. You know. So yes, Downhouse, I feel, is part of English history. It may be a dark part of English history, but it is part of English history. And I think we ought to preserve it and say, look, this is where we were led down, or right, shall I say, right up the garden path. And it's rather like the Piltdown fossils. I haven't got the nerve to go up to the British Museum and say, I want to have a look at the Piltdown fossils because I'm writing about it. Actually, I'm quite a shy person. You wouldn't believe it. I know you won't, but I can assure you I am. But a friend of mine from Sweden had an invitation to meet a Polish assistant to Stringer. And I met this Polish chap and Stringer and my Swedish friend, and they said, oh, Piltdown, yes, here they are. And they went to a cupboard nearby and they pulled down a little cardboard box about as big as that, and they said, yes, here's the Piltdown fossils. And there was I, actually handling the original Piltdown fossils. The canine tooth, the jaw, the skull pieces, they were all there. And I said, but these are treasures. They said, oh, but they're fakes. I said, it doesn't matter the fact that they're fakes. They're part of history. You shouldn't have them in a cardboard box in a cupboard that anybody could take at any moment. And Stringer looked at his assistant and sort of half nodded. And I think they suddenly realised for the first time that whether they were fakes or not doesn't matter. It's still part of English history. And I can only hope that from that moment on, they were put in a rather more secure place than a cardboard box in a cupboard. Because they keep all their precious stuff in a big safe. And that's where I think the Piltdown fossils ought to be. It's for nothing else, as evidence against themselves. Let me go on to this third section of my talk. The heading I've got here, it's Creationist Controversies. But really it's Creationist Miscellany I've got here. Something old, something new, and something challenging. I've divided it into three sections. Those topics in creation I find fascinating, but not many know about them. And one fairly new topic, that is Joshua's long day. It's quite new to me, and I think it'll be quite new to you. Second section will be topics where I believe that creationists are on the wrong course. Now, I'll give my reasons for it. You don't have to agree, but I'm going to give you my reasons where I think certain subjects, creationists, are on the wrong course. And the third section is connected with that, because I finally examine some basic dangers in the creation movement. So let's look at these, certainly what I think some of the most interesting topics. When I give a talk, I've got so much massive information. I say, what do you want me to talk about? And they say, the section I usually like to deal with is the scientific support for Genesis, because that's a lot of information that a lot of Christians haven't heard before. That's my favourite topic. And I say to them, I've got so much information, I have to just simply skim the best things off the top, which I think you'll find particularly interesting. And so that's what I'm going to do just for a few moments here, to put up some pictures of subjects which I've got them in my book, but I think they're particularly fascinating. The first thing is the water vapour canopy and the sudden drop in the lifespans after the flood. Now, I presume you've seen that chart and diagram before. I think it's one of the most fascinating, because if you look at the ages and dates here, 930 years for Adam, Seth, 913 looks like, you go along there, they're just a series of numbers. It is only when you plot them on a diagram, you get this very significant drop after the flood. And why should that be? Well, in my book, I've got 6 possible reasons that may have caused the decrease in the lifespan of the patriarchs. One of them, of course, is radioactive material or decay may suddenly come down as a big lump and then sort of disperse, which caused the sudden drop, and then thereafter it's flattened out. All sorts of reasons, the decrease in the magnetic field, allowing cosmic radiation to come in, which I think is very, very important. And several may have been operating at the same time, because when the flood took place, all sorts of things changed, and a variety of them may have caused this decrease in the lifespan of the patriarchs. I think that's one of the very fascinating pictures there. And as far as I can understand, and I read as widely as I reasonably can, but I get the feeling that the water vapour canopy is under a bit of a cloud at the moment, mainly because... Now, that wasn't intended. that word's been very used, but I always use it. You put me off my stroke now. That's right. Yes, the water vapour's under a cloud. No, there are no clouds. There are no clouds above the water vapour canopy. But it is not being quoted quite as strongly as it has been in the past. And apparently it's because computer studies have shown that as far as they can make out at the moment, the maximum depth of water, if it was solid water, instead of it being 40 feet of solid water, which would have produced enormous deluge, they can only accommodate 2 feet of water. But I would say that these computer studies are very crude in their way. They have to take into account so many different things that they have to make certain simplifications. And one of the things they can't take into account is a very thin layer of cloud, like a very light cloud layer. All sorts of things could come in which may enable the computers to show that a 40-foot or thereabouts depth of water is much more acceptable. But for those who doubt whether the water vapour canopy is still really a viable thing, I would ask a few questions. First of all, how do you interpret Genesis 1:4 in dividing the water from the waters? I think one creationist has actually put the waters right out beyond the star limit, I believe, something like that. Am I right? I see a few nodded yes. I know. You all know who I'm talking about. How on earth he gets his flood waters from there, I don't know. But it might take a little bit of time. So I would say, how do you interpret Genesis 4:1? 1:4, yes. Secondly, where did the 40 days of violently heavy rain come from? Because it couldn't have been from ordinary clouds. And certainly, as I've said, it couldn't have come from beyond the stars. And there is a third factor which I've pointed to. And when I was writing True Science Agrees with the Bible, I went through every issue of CRSQ. There's a whole pile of them. I got every one of the last of the right going back, and I went through every one. And there is a lot of information in those CRSQs in the old days that everybody's forgotten about. And I pulled out one fact which I thought was quite fascinating. If you imagine the Earth is here, and we've got the water vapor canopy around it, the sunlight comes in, and the sunlight wavelength is about 0.2 to 0.9 microns. It goes straight through the water canopy, and it goes through it, and it can start to warm up the Earth. When the Earth warms up, it re-emits that energy in a different wavelength. And the wavelength now is much longer. It's 18 to 13 microns. Now, what happens when it hits the water vapor canopy? Is it blocked? Water vapor canopy blocks an awful lot. But it so happens that there is a window in the water vapor canopy spectrum which allows the wavelengths of 8 to 13 microns through with much less attenuation. Just that window appears in water vapor, which is just exactly matched by the radiation wavelengths coming from the Earth. Now, they've looked at this rather more closely, and they say, well, of course, there's so much water vapor, it gets annihilated, so it doesn't really work. All I'm merely pointing to is the fact that it's too much of a coincidence in my mind that the frequency or the wavelength emitted by the Earth is exactly matched by a window of admission in water vapor. And I think that was not coincidence. That was God making sure that the Earth did not overheat. Now, whatever the computer studies do from that point onwards, okay, let's try and see if we can make a workable model. But please, I would suggest that you do not abandon the water vapor canopy idea, which I think some people may have done. The next subject, and these are very personal, these are things that I found fascinating, the flood tales around the earth on slide 14. Anthropologists brought back all sorts of stories of a great flood from all over the world, dozens and dozens of them. A few hundred. And you can see from this diagram that there is a central core going right the way through it. And that is of the ark provided, destruction by water, and human seed saved. They go right the way through because that's the core of the story. But right the way round, and that's in a geographical sequence, right the way round to Hawaii and Sumatra, you've still got the same story. And you'll notice that you've even got the story of a bird being sent out, or reference to a bird on that lower line there, the third one up. So even right round the other side of the world, there's some sort of a hint about a bird being sent out. Now that to me indicates that they actually did happen in the past history of mankind. And it quite clearly shows that this actually took place and is preserved in the folklore of the people. And I was in Moscow, 3 or 4 years ago now, I think it was, 5 years, I don't know, I'm terrible on dates. And I can remember speaking about this, and a professor from a Moscow university was there, and he said, I think through the translator, well, I think that they're there because the gods of the high ground happen to be superior to the gods of the low ground, and the low ground gods were the ones that were swamped in floods and that. And I said to him, how can you say that when you've got so many similar characteristics, so many similar features like the bird being found, divine favour on the saved, man in transgression. You've got so many different things right the way through. Very specific things still preserved in these folklores, even people around the other side of the world. How can you say that it's just simply the difference between gods of the high ground and the low ground? And I can remember to this day, as I was speaking and was listening to the answer, the sweat was pouring off his brow. And I think he must have suddenly realized that what he'd been teaching his students all these years, as you can dismiss it, actually may well have some accurate foundation. And similarly, they say that it's perhaps spread by missionaries. But if the missionaries were there, surely you'd get a few stories about Jesus or God or something like that in it. There's no story, just purely the flood. And that indicates to me quite clearly that it must have taken place. Next subject is the sun's shrinkage. Eddy and Bournaisian checked the records of the Greenwich Observatory. And if you want to get the exact centre of the sun, you have to measure the exact time when the first limb comes opposite your hairline, pointing due north. And as the sun goes across, you get the exact time within a split second when the rear end of the sun goes across it, because you can't tell when it's right bang in the middle. Just divide the two, and then you can find out where the sun is accurate within a split second. They do it very, very accurately. And he looked through the records of the Greenwich Observatory, and he found this general trend. So they went away and they checked the records of the American Naval Observatory, and they found that it confirmed these figures. Now, I was working through this for quite some time, and I thought, well, I'm reading all these papers critical of Eddy and Bournaisian's paper. I really must get hold of the original. Obviously, you want the original. So I sent off what I thought was the original. All it was the notes before the lecture was given, where the lecture was going to be held, a brief summary of the subject, and that was all. Eddy and Bournaisian's paper has never, ever been produced, never been written up. And some creationists said, well, of course, the whole research was very poor indeed. It was so poor that even Eddy has abandoned the idea. Rubbish. That paper was never, ever published, simply because it would have smacked too much of a young Earth. Because they say this is what is called a secular decrease. That chart that I copied, as accurate as I could, came from a paper that was critical of Eddy and Bournaisian. The original paper I've never ever seen. I wrote to Eddy himself personally. I found his address from the Astronomical Society, wrote to him personally in America, never got a reply. And one paper said, well, of course, he's now abandoned that idea. He's written a paper saying that the sun's diameter goes up and down, or words to that effect. And when you look at that paper, it only covers a period of 17 years. Nothing like the 200 or 300 years that you have here. Now, I have been absolutely slammed uphill and downdale for actually claiming that the sun is shrinking by a creationist on a creationist network. Some of his arguments were very poor. I made one reply and just simply left it at that. Because to me that simply shouts at you. There is no tendency for it to go up or down. It's quite clearly decreasing. And it is decreasing at a more than sufficient speed. I think it's 5, 6, 7 or 10 or 100 times more than enough to generate the heat that the sun is sending out. The sun does not need radioactive material in its core or anywhere. There is enough energy at this rate of shrinkage to produce all the energy that the sun is sending out at the moment. And in fact, when they look, as you well know, we're very knowledgeable creationists, there are only 1/3 of the neutrons, is it neutrons or neutrinos? I'm so glad you're well knowledgeable, aren't you? Neutrinos, you've got the right word, my goodness me, neutrinos, yes, fine. Only 1/3 of the neutrinos that they would expect from the centre of the sun if it was all due to radioactive material at the centre. And therefore, that paper by Eddy and Bournaisian has been simply wiped off the slate. Just the same way, in 1986, the Huxley Memorial Debate in Oxford, there was a debate in Oxford on the evolution, is evolution true or false, the whole thing. And it was Wilder Smith and Edgar Andrews versus Dawkins and Maynard Smith. And the amazing thing is that when they had a vote at the end, 37% voted for the creationists. That is right in the heart of the academic world. 37%, having heard all the arguments, 37% voted for the creationists. That so shocked the establishment that to this day, if you go to the Oxford Union Society and ask to see anything about that debate, it never, ever took place. They have wiped the whole record off the slate. David C.C. Watson bought the rights, the royalty to the tapes. It cost him £50, which was quite a fair bit at that time. And CSM have got a record of those tapes as well, of that debate. And the result was 37%. So what did they do? That debate is wiped right off the slate. It does not exist as far as the Oxford Union debate are contending for. It does not exist. And that is how they handle any evidence that supports the creationist cause. Let me now turn to another subject, which is the one I'm sure you're all very interested to hear about, Joshua's long day. I found this evidence. It's about the time of Joshua in Joshua 10, the war against the 5 kings, in which Joshua said, stop the sun where it is, let's fight for an extra 24 hours. And I found this evidence in quite a controversial book. I was mainly interested in the second half of the book, but had I read the first half rather more carefully, I would have seen this evidence, and I would have made sure, absolutely certain, it would have gone into my book, True Science Agrees with the Bible. It shows I read too quickly sometimes. I was so interested in the second half that I completely missed the significance of this particular. It takes 3 or 4 pages of this particular bit. And so let's have a look at this map of the world where there are 9 accounts in North America, 9 accounts there, all right, and 4 in Africa, in the Middle East, and 1 in China and 1 in India. And I will draw to your attention 2 particular points. If the story of a long day, much longer than before, some of course are exaggerating to several days, but there's a story of a long day in those places that have been tracked down. Now, if they were made up by the local folk people, some might have a story of a long day, some might have a story of a long night, and they would be all over the place. People do make up stories. But you notice one particular thing about this graph is that all the long night stories are in one area and all the long day stories are in another area. That shadow, you can see there's a red arrow there going on, actually is the shadow of night that moves round the earth. And so you can adjust that so that it covers all those that have got a long night and all those that have got a long day. So that's the first point. A, it's not random. Secondly, you can make the shadow of the earth around about that time cover precisely the long days and the long nights properly. But there is one account which gives you an even more accurate representation. That is the one called X, and that was in Fiji, I think. And there they have a story of the sun setting, but not setting for 24 hours. So we know it's just about to be dusk. So we can move that shadow along until it's just touching that point there. And that fixes reasonably accurately, when this long day started, because the sun came down the horizon and it stuck there for 24 hours. And so we can move the shadow to that position there, and then by the distance between the shadow and where at Sinai, I think that's circle A, you can work out roughly what time it was. So we can shift that shadow around and work out exactly where that should take place. And he gives a time of somewhere between 8:30 to 9:30 and round about 3 or 4 days either side of May the 12th, 1448. Now that is according to his chronology. I'm sure all creationists may have some sort of idea of chronology, and we'll find they're all different. I don't know whether it ties in with, I gave 2 chronologies in my book, but that's the date he gave. But it's interesting that you can get the shadow to fit them very, very accurately. I think it's a fascinating chart. If you like puzzles, and I took this as a bit of a challenge, work out for yourself how that black shadow changes shape as you go from summer to winter to summer again. I found it quite challenging, quite interesting. It doesn't do quite what you expect. How does that black shadow change its shape as you go from summer to winter to summer? I'll leave that with you. Now let me go on to the second part of the third section of the talk, Creationist Controversies. And I'm going to deal very briefly with decreasing the speed of light, CDK. And for anybody who doesn't know what CDK is, there's a lovely shorthand. It is C, which is the speed of light, the symbol for the speed of light, decay. So when I talk about CDK, I'm really talking about reduction of the speed of light. It's a nice short mnemonic. Now, Setterfield, when he was really the originator of this, and he collected all his stuff together, and he started publishing his papers, and when I read his paper in 1980, I thought it was absolutely fascinating, because I said to myself, this man has done his homework. And I have seen him up against top-grade professionals from all over the world. In the early days, Setterfield sent me a whole wad of correspondence, and it was from professional, top-grade scientists arguing with Setterfield. And every single time I could see that Setterfield came out on top. Every time. No trouble. And I have followed that man, as far as the speed of light is concerned, because he's so much, I cannot deal with the handling of the mathematics. His knowledge of atomic formula is far superior to anybody else that I've ever seen. In fact, he picked up, I debated the age of the Earth with Alan Hayward many years ago, Dave will remember this, and he actually brought up the fact that he'd sent some of Setterfield's stuff to an American professor, and he'd said, don't touch it. If he was a graduate, I'd give him an absolute tearing off a strip. And in fact, it doesn't even obey Maxwell's laws, and he wrote down a few lines. He sent them to me, I couldn't deal with it, sent it to Setterfield. Setterfield said, he's not taking into account that this certain factor is here, and if you put that in there and put that in there, the whole thing balances perfectly. He knew more about the atomic formula than that professor did in America. And I have never yet seen him defeated. In fact, now, if you're interested, Tift has found that there's quantization in the redshift. If you don't follow me, don't worry. But there's quantization in the redshift, and Setterfield's latest paper, which he's trying to get published in a secular book, gives an explanation from the atomic formula as to how those shifts and those steps, it doesn't come in a nice straight curve, it comes in steps. Tift has found that, and Setterfield has now got an atomic explanation for that, and he's trying to get it published. So, Setterfield had a problem. What does he include and what does he exclude? And he just could not win. Because if he excluded of the 160 or more results that he had, they would say, but this chap says that his stuff is not accurate. So, okay, then, Setterfield, look, it's not accurate. Let's miss it out. And another group of people would come up and say, you're only selecting it just to boost your thing. You're missing out things that contradict it. He just could not win. And so this controversy has gone on for quite some time. Now, I'm going to refer to two arguments. And this is where you're not going to like me very much, I'm afraid. I'm going to refer to two arguments. One is to say, it's due to increasing accuracy of the instruments. And the other is to say, it's intellectual phase lock. That if there's a certain speed of light here, anybody working out what the speed of light should be doesn't want to depart too far from it. And so then somebody else does a speed of light measurement, and they don't want to be too far from it. So they put in it's called intellectual phase locking, because they don't want to be too different from their peers and contemporaries. I would say that they are not just bad arguments, they are dangerous arguments. And why they are dangerous is what I will be finishing with. They are very, very dangerous arguments. Because if the evidence for the speed of light had been constant, you would expect a certain graph like this one. You would start off with very large error bars dotted all over the place, but as they got more and more accurate, it would finish up with the same speed of light that you've had before. It's what I call my funnel-shaped diagram, all right? Is that not the sort of shape of diagram that you would expect to see? Now let us look at two graphs of the decrease of the speed of light and tell me if they're anything like that at all. Look at those results up there, gradually falling, 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 falling. And if we take that bit at the end there, we can blow it up and produce the second graph, and we can see that it is still falling. Now, you do not have to be a mathematical statistician to be convinced that the speed of light is falling. And I would point out one particular point, is that the error bars are all above the present speed of light, well above it. So although the error bars were bigger in the past, they were still more than sufficient to prove that the speed of light is faster than it is today. More than adequate. So all this emphasis upon the high accuracy that we have today is only used as a means of getting rid of some of these very clear indications that the speed of light was much faster in the past. Now, I'm going to leave it there. May we all have an overwhelming desire to glorify God in all that we do, for all that remains of our earthly life, and then throughout all eternity. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention.